Wrestlers are often at the mercy of how they're booked, and that's why getting a push is so crucial if they ever want to find any real success. Sadly though, despite being planned, not all pushes make it out of the starting blocks, with the reason for this varying from person to person. What are the biggest examples of planned pushes that never materialized? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Finn Balor in 2016. Yes, after making a name for himself in New Japan during the late 2000s and early 2010s, there were a lot of expectations placed on the man then going by the name of Prince Devitt when he eventually signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2014. And at least initially, those expectations seemed to be getting met, as throughout his run on NXT, he'd be one of the top babyfaces on the brand and a multiple-time world champion. But then 2016 came and things started to fall apart for the Irishman, as the push which was expected for him on the main roster never exactly materialized. Sure, it wasn't as if WWE didn't make an attempt to push him here. No, they actually went all in on the former IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion by having him pin Roman Reigns clean on his first night on Raw. And then after that, they'd have him go on to SummerSlam a few weeks later, where he'd beat Seth Rollins to become the inaugural Universal Champion. That said, it was while winning this belt that Finn would suffer a shoulder injury during a botched buckle bomb, with this meaning that the very next night on Raw, he'd have to vacate his newly won gold. Would Vince McMahon do what many people hoped he would do here and wait for Balor to return from this injury, then put him right back into title contention? No, unfortunately for fans everywhere, by the time the Bray native came back to WWE, the boss had moved on. And this meant Finn spending the rest of his main roster run to date playing the role of mid-carder who occasionally gets slotted a little higher on the card on a temporary basis. Needless to say then, this was a disappointment for the man who looked like he was going to be the company's next big thing for a brief moment there, as he'd never again even approach this level. Even today, he's largely used as a tag team act alongside his Judgment Day stablemates, a far cry from the man who was winning the NXT title when he first arrived in WWE. But what of another man who hails from across the pond who also seemed to have a run as world champion in his future, which was cut short, with this one happening way back in 2008? Doesn't he deserve a spot in this video too? Well, yes he does, and that's why he's our next subject, William Regal. Now, anyone who's been a long-term wrestling fan will be all too aware of how great William Regal was. Honestly, he did it all in that he can outwork most of his peers in the ring, cut great promos, and has influenced just about everyone who's come after him. That said, one thing he was never able to do during his in-ring career was win a world title. In fact, the only time he ever really came close was in 2008. What happened here? Well, after becoming Raw general manager and then winning the King of the Ring in the spring of that year, the Staffordshire native suddenly found himself in the position of being arguably the top heel on the Red brand. And that was because his megalomaniacal, power-hungry character got very over with fans in a very short space of time. So over did he get here, in fact, there was a point where WWE were reportedly considering putting that ever-elusive world title on him at last. But that never happened in the end because, after getting suspended for a wellness policy violation soon thereafter, he'd find himself stuck in the doghouse. Of course, it should be noted here that while many assumed at the time this wellness policy violation was a sign that Regal had fallen off the wagon after getting himself sober some period prior, he has since disputed such claims, with him arguing that what actually happened was a small amount of some substance came up on his test. But even if this is the real story behind what took place, it doesn't change the fact that, sober or not, the end result was the Englishman was now being suspended. And because WWE was particularly sensitive to these things back then, as it still wasn't long after both the passing of Eddie Guerrero and the whole Chris Benoit situation, they felt they just couldn't put William back in the spot he'd been in before upon his return, otherwise the optics might look bad. So it was then that rather than getting a run as world champion, the former World of Sports star would find himself returned to the mid-card again and never really leaving that spot for the rest of his in-ring career. What a cruel twist of fate that was then, as the OG villain on top of the mountain really could have been something to see. But then he's not the only Ruthless Aggression era star who missed out on a run on top by mere inches, as a year prior in 2007, the exact same thing would happen to our next subject, Mr. Kennedy! Mr. Kennedy. What could have been? What you had in him was what you have in L.A. Knight today, a very popular upper mid-carder who could talk like few others on the roster and who, at points, seemed poised to fully rise up to the level of true main event superstar. This was certainly the plan for the Wisconsin native in 2007, as that was the year he walked into WrestleMania 23 and won the Money in the Bank ladder match, with this all but guaranteeing a world title run would be coming in the near future for him. Sadly, though, that's not how things would play out for Kennedy, and the reason for this was because he picked up what was believed at the time to be a pretty serious injury in early June. So serious was this injury considered to be at first. In fact, it was assumed he'd be out for several months recovering. So, pivoting from their original plans then, WWE chose to have him quickly drop the Money in the Bank contract to Edge on a random episode of Raw. But that turned out to be an unnecessary move, as soon after this, it was determined that Ken's injury wasn't as bad as it had first looked to be. Still though, even if he was only going to be out for a matter of weeks now instead of months, what was done, and his guaranteed title shot was now gone. But he could still recover and get that big push anyway, right? Wrong, because later on in that same year, after finally getting himself back on track during a feud with The Undertaker and a storyline where he was supposed to be revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son, Mr. Kennedy would shoot himself in the foot when he'd fail a wellness test, with this leading to him being suspended and placed in the doghouse. Needless to say then, when Kennedy returned to WWE after that, things would be very different for him, and he'd never even sniff the main event scene again. No, he'd remain in the mid-card from here on in, all the way up until he was cut from his contract in 2009. Sure, he would bounce back to some degree in TNA during the mid-2010s, but with that being a much smaller platform, he'd never become the star he could have been. Sometimes though, when a big push doesn't materialize for a performer, it's not their fault. No, sometimes it's entirely due to outside circumstances, as the case was with our next subject back in 2005, Muhammad Hassan. That's right, if you were a fan of that early to mid ruthless aggression era period, then you'll be familiar with the story of Muhammad Hassan, a character portrayed by Italian-American Mark Copani, who was playing an Arabic person in a post-9/11 world. And pretty quickly, the whole story devolved into a foreign heel menace angle, and when that happened, it was always going to be a matter of time before the real-life tensions of the day caused this one to go off the rails. What no one could have foreseen, though, was just how this would happen, as it was right in the middle of Hassan's feud with The Undertaker, a feud which was supposed to lead to him defeating the Dead Man, then going on to beat Batista for the World Heavyweight title, that a segment would take place on an episode of SmackDown in which the heel led a bunch of masked men down to the ring to seemingly use Mark Calloway as a sacrifice. Yes, it would have been a touchy angle at the best of times, but it was made all the worse by the fact that it aired on the same day as the 7/7 London attacks. So because of this, SmackDown's TV network at the time, UPN, demanded that Muhammad be taken off of the show with immediate effect. As you would expect then, this instantly ended his big push to the top of the card. But not just that, no, it ended his entire career as a WWE wrestler. Seriously, after being beaten by The Undertaker at the Great American Bash mere days later, Muhammad Hassan would disappear from WWE TV forever. And that's a great shame for Mark Copani, as he hadn't done anything wrong. No, he'd only been portraying the gimmick his bosses had asked him to, and because he did that, he never ended up reaching the levels he could have. That said, he would end up bouncing back in his personal life by getting a job as a teacher, a job he maintains to this day and seems very happy doing. Well, let's move away from the 2000s for now and back a little bit further to the 90s, as it's there we find our next subject, a man who seemed poised for main event superstardom in 1999, but who ended up having the legs cut right out from under him before this could happen. Who are we talking about here? Why, Billy Gunn, of course. Now, Billy Gunn is someone who, on the face of things, should have been a dead cert for main event superstardom in WWE. After all, he's big, has a great look, and was a very athletic guy overall. He was certainly the one out of the New Age Outlaws who seemed like he had bigger things in his future. And so that was why, when this group broke up in 1999 and Billy went solo, it was assumed the sky was the limit for him. Hell, so all in were WWE on the man then going by the outrageous name of Mr. Ass after he won the 1999 King of the Ring, they'd book him in a SummerSlam program with The Rock that August. Unfortunately though, this was where things started to go off the rails for the Florida native. Why was that? Well, the Great One took it upon himself to bury the heel in a now infamous promo. You know the one. It's the one where God talks to Billy and tells him that he absolutely sucks. So when he lost to Dwayne Johnson at SummerSlam, he'd quickly be shuffled right back down into the mid-card again, with this being where he remained for the rest of his time in WWE. Even when he left in the years following and eventually went to places like TNA and AEW, he'd remain in that same spot, never again getting a chance to prove that he could be a top-level act. That said, Billy Gunn seems happy enough in his current role in AEW, where he gets to mentor the likes of Anthony Bowens and his own sons, Austin and Colton Gunn. One person who's not had a great time in AEW, though, has been our next subject, someone whose downfall began with an aborted push in 2020 and 2021 in WWE, someone who goes by the name of Keith Lee. Yes, Keith Lee is another figure who came so close to having it all in WWE, and again, why wouldn't he? As being a big man who can talk and has an unreasonable amount of athleticism for a man his size, he was everything you would imagine Vince McMahon was looking for, a second coming of someone like Vader. Triple H certainly understood what the company had with the Wichita Falls native, as after signing him up to a developmental contract in 2018, and from there putting him on NXT, it wouldn't take long for the big man to go all the way to the top. Seriously, come 2020, just 2 years after his debut there, he'd be briefly merging the NXT World and North American titles when he beat Adam Cole at the Great American Bash that summer. But then things went wrong for everyone involved, as mere months later, Lee would be called up to the main roster. Why was this such a big problem? Well, there he was going to be booked by Vince McMahon, who rebranded him as Bearcat Lee. And this one turned out to be a colossal flop then, as almost instantly Keith's aura was shattered. And things would only get worse after that, as he'd fall seriously ill during the global shutdown. So bad would this be, in fact, even had he been given a better chance to succeed upon his return to the ring, any push he was getting on NXT would never have come back around again, as by now his health was in such poor state he was reportedly unable to do much of what he'd done in the ring before. And that's something which affects him to this day, it seems, with this probably being one of the major reasons that, despite having been signed to AEW since 2022, he hasn't appeared on TV since December of 2023. Really, at this point, it feels like his in-ring career is all but done, and that even if a WWE return was in his future at some point down the line, the push he'd get upon heading back over to WWE would be unlikely to be successful. But what about our next subject? Someone who also seemed like they were in line for a big WWE main roster push at one point following a successful spell on the NXT roster, but who quickly found this push evaporating. A man known to us all then by the name of Lars Sullivan. Of course, at the time it felt obvious that Lars Sullivan would be getting a big push in WWE though, because like with some of the other people we've looked at today already, he seemingly had everything Vince McMahon was looking for in a star, in that he was a big guy who would catch someone's attention at the airport. No, he was never the best wrestler in the world, but during his time on NXT, he was still able to get a prominent spot on the show regardless, with him often being in the hunt for the North American title there. So it felt like when the boss called him up to Raw in late 2018 then, things were going to continue in the same manner for him, but in the end, that's not what happened. Why was this? Well, prior to his debut appearance on the Red brand, Lars apparently suffered a panic attack backstage, and this led to him having to be pulled from the show at the last minute. But at least he'd be around in subsequent weeks and everything would go on from there as planned, right? Well, no, because while Sullivan would eventually be dominating during early feuds against the likes of Lucha House Party, some pretty nasty old forum posts he made back in the day would be unearthed soon thereafter, and this would lead to him being taken off of TV and sent to sensitivity training as punishment. Needless to say then, it was all just turning into a bit of a mess for the Colorado native here, as by this point, fans had little interest in watching him. And as if that weren't bad enough, his bosses were obviously cooling on him as a performer more and more every week. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone then, when in January of 2021, he'd be quietly released from his contract, with the big man doing an interview soon thereafter where he stated he was likely done as an in-ring performer forever. So don't expect Lars Sullivan to return to WWE anytime soon. And also don't expect to see him show up anywhere else like in AEW or New Japan. No, those days appear to be over for him for good as of 2025, and he wasn't the only one who things weren't working out for at the turn of the decade, as back in 2019, a similar situation was happening with our next subject and their aborted push. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Mustafa Ali? That's right, we all know just how good of an in-ring performer Mustafa Ali can be. After all, for his entire career, he's been putting on some of the better high-flying cruiserweight action you're going to see during the 2010s and 2020s. And this was exactly why he'd be signed up to a contract with WWE in 2016, and from there made a key piece of both the Cruiserweight Classic and 205 Live. The only problem, though, was that so few people were watching these shows, it didn't do a huge amount to raise the Illinois native's profile with the main roster audiences. So it must have felt like a lifeline to him when he was called up to the main roster in late 2018, and an even greater lifeline when, in early 2019, he started getting something of a push. Yes, this was the point that Ali even earned himself a spot in that year's Elimination Chamber match for the WWE title. Unfortunately, though, before that bout could take place, injury would force the high flyer to have to step aside and make way for Kofi Kingston instead. And you all know what happened after that, Kofi Mania. How bitter a pill this must have been to swallow then, because while we've no doubt it felt good for Mustafa to see his friend catch fire the way he did here, there must have been a feeling that this moment should have been his instead. But at least it wasn't over yet, because at Money in the Bank later that year, Ali was set to win the contract during the titular ladder match. Or at least that's what he thought was going to happen. In truth though, mid-match he'd be informed that plans had changed and that Brock Lesnar was actually going to be walking out with the briefcase. So like that then, the former cop's hopes of winning a world title were quite literally taken away from him at the 11th hour. And once this was done, he'd never again even sniff such a prominent spot in WWE. No, the only other real thing of note he'd do prior to his eventual release in 2023 would be his run as the leader of Retribution, and the less said about that, the better. Still though, even if he's now working on smaller stages like TNA, at least Mustafa has been able to bounce back there somewhat as an X Division champion. So it's not like all has been lost for him. One person who was never able to bounce back properly after his push in WWE came to nothing, however, would be our next subject. A man who seemed like he was going to have a very big role on the show, but ended up being little more than a footnote, Mordecai. Now, it would be very easy to forget Mordecai entirely today, as, if truth be told, he wasn't actually around for that long. Now, if you go back and look at the history of the character, it only actually existed for a few months back during the summer of 2004. But during that summer, there were certainly big plans for the whole thing, as the idea was clearly to set it up as being a major rival to The Undertaker. After all, with the religious zealot gimmick and the all-white look, it was basically looking at a negative image of the dead man. So as the weeks went on then and Mordecai started getting more established, everyone could see what the planned end result was here, a showdown between the dark and the light at WrestleMania. But in the end, that's not what would happen. No, rather than get a major bout against Mark Calloway on the grandest stage of them all, Kevin Thorne's run as the Zealot Preacher would come to an end by the time the summer was over. Why was that? Well, it was because despite WWE management really wanting Mordecai to get over with fans, it quickly became apparent he was not going to, as for one reason or another, the crowd just didn't take to him. And so that was why any plans to link the heel up with The Undertaker in the lead up to WrestleMania were dropped, and Thorne was pulled from TV for a while. What happened when he eventually returned? Well, that would be when he got rebranded as a vampire on WWE CW, and this one never saw him reach the main event either. And as for that idea of dark versus light for an Undertaker WrestleMania feud, well, that would later be reused when, at WrestleMania 25, the Battle of Heaven and Hell took place when Shawn Michaels and The Phenom had one of the greatest matches in WWE history. So in a way, things did work out in some ways then, as fans got a bona fide classic to watch and rewatch forever. Sure, it might not have led to much more for Kevin Thorne, but at least he kept a job for a while, all the way up until 2009 in fact. And once that WWE run finally came to an end, he would continue to work on the indie circuit, with this being something he continues to do right up until the present day. But let's move away from him for now and over to our next subject, someone who, for a very brief window of time in 2011, felt like they might be getting a push up the card, but who quickly saw this bright future slip out of his grasp, the man known to fans back then as Alex Riley. What happened here? Well, after simmering tensions between Alex Riley and his tag team partner at the time, The Miz, eventually boiled over, Riley would turn on Mizanin on the May 23, 2011 episode of Raw, and in the process, morph into a babyface for the first time. Obviously then, now that he was a babyface, the expectation was that the Virginian was going to be getting more to do on the show. And that's the way things appeared to be going initially, as it was soon after this that Riley became an on-screen ally of John Cena as part of both their continued feuds with The Miz. Sadly though, it also seems like this is where the problems began, as after apparently doing something to upset Big Match John behind the scenes, the rising star would find his push being cut off at the knees before it had a chance to really grab a foothold with fans. Yes, if the stories are to be believed, this was Cena making sure Riley didn't go up any higher in the card in the future. And that would certainly match up with what played out on screen from there, as by the time 2012 came around, the boy from Fairfax Station would be undergoing something of a losing streak. Hell, so bad would things get for him, by 2013, he'd be retiring from the ring altogether. Sure, he would continue to work for WWE for a while here as a commentator for the NXT brand, but a brief return to action in 2016 aside, this would mark the end for him as an actual wrestler, at least on the big stage. Could he have been more? It's hard to say, as we never really got to see much of what Riley could do in a pushed role. He certainly had a lot of potential though. So all we're left with then is speculation about how things might have been. Maybe he could have risen as high as the level of a world champion, or maybe he would have frittered out anyways. It's impossible to know exactly how things would have played out, just as it is for everyone else we've looked at today.